you. So I wanted to pick up the disruptive data center thread. I'm going to ask the folks to introduce themselves, and I just want to say that we were hoping for Nancy Novak, VP of Construction at Compass Data Centers, to join. She's not here. She may have relied on the local train system, which would explain why she's not here, but hopefully she will appear. So, Kelly and Kelly? This is my first panel with two Kellys.
I know.
No confusion there.
Yeah.
So I'm Kelly LeValley Hunt. Hopefully you guys were here earlier. I'm the VP of Sales at BlockApps. My background is software and data centers. It's a little bit about me.
All right. So Kelly Morgan, I'm Vice President of Multi-Tenant Data Centers and Managed Services for 451 Research. So Rhonda and I are colleagues. And I have a background originally in finance and private equity and kind of the economics of data centers, and then kind of moving into more of the services angle.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask a few questions and then open it up to the audience. I want to start out with, from your different perspectives, what would you say has been among the most disruptive forces in the data center sector in recent memory? And Kelly Morgan, if I could kick it off with you.
It's going to be difficult for you, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was kind of thinking about this whole panel and the theme for the panel, I wanted to bring it back to cloud, just fundamentally because being in this industry for a long time, we've talked about kind of technology disruptors and potential for, especially when I was first getting into it, high density and how that would impact people, but things like free air cooling. And I know I personally did not always think about the kind of end user factors, and the cloud providers having come in and really forced a lot of change to happen. I mean, they've forced technology change to go where they needed it to go. And I think it's been interesting as well that compared to perhaps some enterprises that were really on the cutting edge themselves, who built their own data centers and operated them, because the cloud providers have leased space as well as built their own, they've expanded kind of their requirements and kind of caused this tidal wave of change to meet their needs in a much broader way than if they had, say, just kind of focused on building their own data centers. So things from high density to interconnection to the need for speed, I mean, that's been huge. And I think all of those have had a big impact, more so than I would have predicted probably 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. And on the enterprise side, I think, you've talked about the supply side, the colos, the wholesalers. For enterprises, to some degree, they're all competing with cloud.
Right,
Massive efficiencies and economies of scale that cloud hyperscale data centers enjoy. And I think it's really transformed the data center from being a cost center black box for businesses to having more financial scrutiny and hopefully increased efficiency as a result.
Yeah.
Kelly LeValley Hunt, what's your thinking on most recent memory, huge disruption to this industry?
I think my most memorable disruption was a friend of mine used to own a couple of, before the global gobble started, in Europe, where larger data centers started gobbling up smaller data centers. I think the most memorable moment was when I got a phone call, in a co-location in Belgium. One of their customers had put in a bunch of blade servers without even thinking about it and took down the entire data center. So I think that was my most memorable moment. I think in recent years, data centers are starting to, and were starting to at that time, build their own substations. And I thought that was really remarkable, that they actually expanded outside the data center and didn't want to rely on the grid. They started building their own substations and working with the energy providers to make that happen. I think that was probably the most memorable in recent years. And then now recently with the blockchain and the latency demands on power and connection.
I had a feeling you were going to mention blockchain.
Well, I was going to say actually that in addition to data centers having to step outside and provide power and secure that with their own substations, the same thing's happening with network, right? So they're having to connect up their data centers together with their own dark fiber networks. And so they're kind of, that's the next step, I think, to catch up with these latency demands.
Definitely. So my second question, what could disrupt the data center, do you think, in the future? And again, Kelly, Morgan, I'm going to start with you and work back.
Yeah, this is a big one. I mean, anything from the 10 technologies that you put up, so certainly artificial intelligence being used in all the demands that's likely to bring. But I think even really big picture, kind of more overarching, would be some of the unpredictable climate change type requirements. Everything from the disasters that come that are having people rethink where their data centers are in Houston, for example. You've got your kind of big picture, where are these potential disaster areas, but then also potential for regulation. I know this keeps coming around, but for energy sources and things like that, potential for increasing regulation for efficiency. I think all of that is still going to be a potential disruptor out there. And there's a lot of different ways to kind of work within that. And a lot of the technologies you talked about, I think, are kind of related to this big picture, how to become more efficient and spend less money, basically.
I just want to pick up on the effects of climate change a little. I think it's one we don't, as an industry, talk about enough. Flood maps are, they're irrelevant from when you may have actually built that or designed or built that facility. Particularly in areas like New York. And I think that it's also a big consideration for, it's redefining what disaster planning, disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning is, even down to staffing approaches. If you have a major climate event and it's wiped out, major services, primary services, how are you going to, you may have enough on-site fuel for your generators, and we are seeing more and more data centers stockpiling, not just stockpiling, but putting in showers and food for those staff and their families for more than a few days. But if it's a major event, your staff is going to look after their family first, right? So one of the things that Uptime Institute recommends is having an out-of-state outsourcing staffing emergency plan, in the event of an extended climate event.
Yeah, one of my colleagues just came back from touring data centers in Tokyo, and looking in depth at all of the earthquake protection that they've set up. And a lot of the firms there said, yeah, we tell our staff, stay here. This is probably your safest location if there's an earthquake. And he was saying, based that huge earthquake that happened before, some of the data centers have kind of marks that show how much they've moved, and they had moved 10 inches just from that one data center, but kept running. So if you want to be anywhere in Tokyo, it's basically in a data center. So
in the U.S., that's kind of people prepare for disasters. They stockpile diesel, and they make sure that things will continue to be up and running. That's kind of like the everyday in Nigeria. They have the power goes off about 5 times a day, and they have generators to back it up. And there's countries that actually do that every day. It's not they don't depend on the disaster to happen, and they have disaster recovery already planned into their data centers. So for that not to happen here, it's kind of an interesting concept for American data centers to start stockpiling diesel, because that's happening in a lot of countries already as a daily.
Well, and another thing to follow up on, and related, so back to your chart that you had earlier about the amount of investment in a data center, and then the payback over 15 years, which is what you're hoping for. But if your data center is suddenly in a location that's going to be underwater every 3 years, that's one issue. But then also another big potential disruptor is, as Rita was just talking about, IoT, and kind of this whole sense of where data is going to sit and the fact that data centers may need to be in different places. I think that's a real fundamental disruptor that it's very hard for anyone to figure out at this point where that's going to be. I know kind of internally at 451, we're doing a lot of research. We've got an IoT team that's built a whole model of every potential end device and endpoint, kind of connectivity device, and how much data each of those endpoints is expected to generate. And we've started surveying enterprises to ask where they're planning to put that data and where they're putting it now to try to get at this point. How much of that is going to be on the device versus in between versus on the cloud, in some big data center. I think that's all going to be a big transformation going forward.
Yeah, it flips the cloud model.
Yeah.
The centralized cloud model is going to be spread out to the edge.
Well, decentralized blockchain applications will help with disaster recovery as well. So I wouldn't jump into building a disaster recovery site so quickly. I would actually take into consideration blockchain decentralized applications. When your data center goes down, the application will actually recognize that and fall over to the nodes that are out in your decentralized network
Is that
automatically.
happening today, Kelly?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why I'm here.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah, and we're doing it for the banks, JP Morgan. It's unclassified, so I can talk about that. We built the blockchain for JP Morgan. They are very much focused on making sure that the applications that they have running in the blockchain are decentralized. That's the whole point of blockchain. So I don't think that's going to be a disruptor for the data center industry. I think that's going to be, it's kind of like, in the beginning of cloud, I worked with Novell NetIQ for security. I was one of the founding 4 members of the security and identity management for cloud for Novell NetIQ. And one of the things that people would tell us is, oh, well, with the cloud, all your data, you don't have to have the data centers. All the data center space is going to decrease.
Yep.
And I looked at them like, what? What about the data growing? So with blockchain, data centers aren't going to decrease. And like I said earlier, latency is a big issue. So we really need to build. But what I think in the future is going to happen is we're not going to build so much on the hyperscale. Maybe I'm wrong. But I don't think we're going to be building so much on the hyperscale. I think we're going to be building on the modular, prefabricated, high-density rack data centers for low latency.
Yeah, I think it's going to be additional capacity. I think the growth at the core with hyperscales, it may or may not slow down, but it's still going to play a key role for archiving, for data integration, for enterprise application. Just the cost of bandwidth, forget about the availability or the latency, just the cost to backhaul that.
Yep.
I think that it's, I agree with you. I think it's going to be additional net new capacity with IoT. I don't think it's going to be at the expense of cloud. Kelly Morgan, I wanted to pick up on something I know that you've been looking at for a long time, which is the financial arena around particularly co-location and wholesale data centers, but indeed all types of data centers. And I was hoping you could maybe just pivot a little for us with this conversation and talk about some of the potential financial disruptions to this industry.
Yes, well, yeah, people do kind of come back to interest rates, right, and that kind of the different financial impacts that could happen if interest rates rose. I mean, that's been talked about for so long, and it's been sort of creeping up, and I think we're going to keep creeping for a while, so people will kind of adjust. I think the cloud providers constantly sort of balancing how much it costs them to build and operate themselves versus leasing. And certainly the economics for them, it makes sense for them to build and operate a lot of these themselves. But because they're growing so quickly and they are going to increasingly need to put things out, closer to the edge, then the economics are a bit more in the favor of leasing. So that'll keep driving the wholesale multi-tenant kind of approach. But I think in all of these, we are going to start to have some challenges around scale, because you've had a lot of the scale for the big cloud providers and wholesale multi-tenant folks coming from building big centralized campuses. And as we start shifting to this model of needing low latency and needing more data centers spread around, it's going to be harder for them to work out the business model of gaining scale, but across, maybe hundreds of locations. So I know there are quite a few companies kind of working on that, and it's one of the biggest questions when it comes to micro-modular data centers. What's the business model for this? How are these going to be paid for? It's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, where people will use kind of whatever is available, and when is the driver going to be here to kind of invest and pay for a lot of smaller sites out there. So I kind of think we'll see this in-between stage where a lot of the local data centers and the small colos, who frankly have been kind of suffering up until now, they've been kind of hanging in there with local business from, say you're a data center in Indianapolis. You've been getting business from kind of local law firms or wherever, but I think those firms will start to become really appealing for some of these lower latency workloads that need to be out a bit more until maybe we see enough demand to kind of head to that next scale model of someone building scale by having these all connected in hundreds of locations.
So the notion of the ghost data center, which
yes.
we're all probably familiar with, this is empty capacity. My understanding is, a lot of it is in the multi-tenant data center space. Is there a danger of there being a lag between that demand at scale, be it cloud, enterprise, industrial, and these, it's coming back down to real estate.
Yeah.
Right? We're doing this full circle. Can you just talk a little bit about what your thinking is around unused capacity and that potential lag?
And there are lots of small colo, local firms out there kind of holding on, waiting for this demand to come.
Right.
I think they actually, in terms of ghost capacity, there is a certain amount out there with them, but a lot of those folks are hanging in there. The ghost capacity I worry about are the enterprise data centers and all the enterprises out there that have a lot of these that are starting to become increasingly empty. We talk to a lot of firms that look at buying them, but getting the economics right and getting an enterprise to write down the cost of some of those facilities is not easy. But you could end up with quite a lot of space coming on, often in somewhat strange locations too, or locations that may or not be immediately desirable. So there's a lot of kind of potential excess supply that could show up there in the next few years.
So thinking about unusual locations, Kelly, I wanted to pick up on something you talked about in your presentation. You mentioned BHP mining, which I didn't expect, frankly. I didn't associate BHP with cryptocurrency. Can you talk about how do they do that if they're in remote locations? Say if they're out in an oil rig in an ocean, because latency is a big part of the success of blockchain. So how do they work around that?
First, let me clarify, BHP Billiton isn't really involved in cryptocurrency. They're more involved in blockchain.
Got you.
It's really important to clarify that, and especially for BHP, because they're a very conservative organization. The innovation team looked at many different blockchain platforms and decided to come and build with BlockApps, luckily, so I have to respect their name. Around the cryptocurrency, it's a little bit, you tag somebody's name with that and they go, whoa, why'd you do that? So they're looking at, what they did was they looked at the mineral rights and where their mineral samples were pulled out of the ground. And they're in very remote locations, and they are, there's latency challenges. So one of the oil rigs that they had, we were trying to transact on the blockchain, and it was giving us some trouble. So we had to build in order to keep that latency down. So it is a challenge, but we just put some equipment out there to speed up the transactions. And so you do have to consider that when you are in foreign locations and locations that aren't traditionally high-density locations with plenty of capacity. So what they did was they pulled the minerals out of the ground and they put it on the blockchain, the GPS on the blockchain, and they transferred that mineral to the next lab. And that lab also sometimes is in not in the middle of a city, for example. So once that mineral sample got to that lab actually identified that and did all the testing required for that and put that information into the blockchain, simultaneously updating all the nodes. So immediately they knew exactly where the sample was, and they could be saving thousands of dollars when they do that and make sure that those samples are in the right location at the right time and understanding where those samples came from. A couple of months ago, the World Wildlife Fund, a very good friend of mine who I grew up with, he called me and he said, we really need to start understanding where we're pulling fish out of the water worldwide. There's a lot of illegal fishing, and Keith Davies was a good friend of his who was on a ship. He was an observer on the ship, and I guess he saw something that he shouldn't have seen and was thrown off the ship and went missing. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, so if you have something on that ship that has a blockchain that's tracking everybody in that ship, tracking all the fish that's pulled out of those waters, whether it's illegal waters, fishing area or not. And then you have a distribution organization or suppliers that actually respect that alliance, that will eliminate those kind of illegal transactions is what they really are in our world. So, but that doesn't mean that every ship will have the ability to transact because of latency.
On every ship.
You know what?
Maybe that's what they need.
There are organizations in the oil and gas industry who take barges out and they put data centers on the barges so they can actually start to transact on the blockchain simultaneously across all the nodes and decentralized applications.
Do they own those floating data centers, or
Some of them do, and some of them lease them.
So could be
Some of them are solar powered, even though it's only 15% converting, but it's worth it for them to keep things up and running on the blockchain.
So blockchain, as it proliferates, we're already starting to see new types and new ownership models around data centers. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and the overhead is decreased because if you put the transactions and the understanding of the smart contracts on the blockchain, you decrease your overhead. So because of less audit trails, less clearinghouses demand, less audits that need to happen because it's automatically auditing itself on the blockchain.
Gotcha. I want to open it up to some questions here. I know we're definitely at morning coffee time. Yes?
I'll keep it simple. With blockchain, this is to address blockchain, I'm glad you gave me a little bit more in terms of some of the value propositions that are sitting in there. But quite frankly, I've been working on the standards before I got kicked out, but working on the standards on distributed ledger technology. When I requested security features to be put into distributed ledger technology, I was promptly told, we don't need that. Okay? Fundamentally, it's wrong. But secondarily, when I looked at more deeply what is required for distributed ledger technology, I'm wondering whether or not the teams that are actually deploying blockchain are not only looking at some of the security holes existing in that technology, but also looking at the sustainability, the energy sustainability of the actual implementation as it stands today. Currently, just for transactions, it's estimated that blockchain over something like a TLS implementation is roughly about 2 orders of magnitude more expensive on blockchain from an energy consumption standpoint and a compute resource consumption standpoint than a TLS or SSL encryption method of validating the transaction.
Is that a statement or a question?
Question is somebody looking at
point.
both the sustainability portion as well as the security portion of the existing blockchain methodologies?
So just to address that, and I'm not really sure what alliances you were working with. The Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is a good organization to be a part of. You get, there's a community there that have the same challenges that all enterprises have. As far as security, I'm not really sure anybody would say there's no need for security. I work with a lot of governments, and that's their main focus. Cybersecurity especially, the US has, 1,000 satellites in orbit constantly, so the security is number one. So any enterprise will, and I've worked with many organizations that security is number one, but there was something interesting that you said. In the blockchain space, we really don't know for sure how it's going to go. Just like in the data center space, we really don't know whether we build a facility and it's going to be filled or not, or we think about a facility and we hope that it's going to be filled. So it really depends, but the predictability is very difficult. So I think security would be actually the number one reason for any questions or any kind of remarks. I can't imagine that nobody would take into consideration security.
Okay, folks, I'm afraid I know there are a lot of questions, but I've been given the wrap-up and there is hot coffee waiting. So I just want to say thank you very much to everybody for being here today. And we're all available after this session. If you do have additional questions, thank you. Thank you to my panelists.
Thank you, Rhonda.